the longest time, say at least in the 20th century, it was presumed that we make a pretty complete model of the world, and then we act in the world and we compare what happens to that model, and as long as our model and the world are matching, then roughly speaking we believe that everything is okay and our emotions stay under control. But if that model mismatches, then we know that something's up. Now, a lot of this work was done by Russians, especially in the early 60s, by two Russian scientists, Vinogradova and Sokolov, who were students of Alexander Luria, who was arguably the greatest neuropsychologist of the 20th century. Luria spent a lot of time studying soldiers from World War II that had received head injuries and of various sorts, and because of that he could draw inferences about how the brain worked, and some of what we're going to talk about over the upcoming weeks with regards to brain function, much of it is predicated on Luria's work. And Sokolov and Vinogradova were his students, and they were interested in this phenomena. They were interested in psycho-physiological measurement, right? So as a way of inferring brain function. And so psycho-physiological measurement is measurement of those physiological parameters, say like pupil width or skin conductance or EEG, that are in some ways directly reflective of how the brain works. Now, if you measure skin resistance changes with the amount that you sweat, and that can change very, very rapidly, and it changes in response to physiological demands placed on your body. So for example, if your body assumes that you're going to leap into action for some purpose, then it's going to open up your pores to prepare you to keep yourself cool, and you can measure those transformations quite accurately by measuring the electrical resistance of the skin. And so what you see, if you put someone in a lab chair and you expose themselves to different stimuli, you find that, for example, if you expose them to something that's threatening, say like a picture of a snake, then their skin conductance will decrease because their skin conductance will increase because they sweat a little bit more, and it's quite a rapid response. It can be a very rapid response. Now, one of the things that Sokolov, yeah, that's right, noted was that if I sat you down, for example, and I put some headphones on you and I played a tone to you that repeated, just exactly the same tone that repeated at predictable intervals, that the first time you heard the tone you'd produce quite a spike in skin conductance, and the next time a slightly smaller spike, and then the next time a slightly smaller spike, until after maybe you'd heard it 3 or 4 times you would not respond to it at all, and that was often regarded as habituation. And habituation is the same thing that you can see in snails, for example, and I'm using snails as an example because they have very, very simple nervous systems. So if you take a snail and you poke it, then like it comes out of its shell and you poke it, it'll go back into its shell, and then it'll come out. Then if you poke it again, it'll go back into its shell and it'll come out. But if you keep doing that, sooner or later the snail will just stop going in. And you might think of that, it has been conceptualized as the simplest form of learning, habituation. And the behaviorists tended to presume that if a human being manifested a response that could be modeled by a simple organism, then the human being was using a response that was analogous to that of the simple organism. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. So, for example, you have simple reflexes that, you know, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you'll jerk back, and that's quite a simple circuit. You'll move your hand back before the message gets to your brain, because the spinal cord is smart enough to mediate reflex like that all by itself. So, you know, your brain is actually quite distributed throughout your body. It's not just in your head like people tend to think. And so we have conserved fast acting reflexes at various levels of our nervous system. They aren't capable of sophisticated response. It's pretty much stimulus response, thinking about it from the behavioral perspective, but they have as an advantage incredible speed because there just aren't that many neural connections between the stimulus and the response. And so we have layers of response at different time frames that help us match with the demands of of the external environment. So Charles Darwin, for example, used to go into the, I think it was museum in England, I don't remember the name of it. They had a snake in there, I believe it was a cobra, and he'd stick his face up at the glass and the cobra would strike at him and he'd jerk back, and he tried many times to master that reflexive response to the snake, but there was no way. Every time that thing struck at him, he jumped backwards. Well, you can imagine the survival utility in a reflex like that, but in reflexes in general. Okay, so back to Sokolov. Now, what he decided, thought, if you took that tone and you did anything to it that was perceptible, right, because there are certain gradations of tone that you're not capable of perceiving, but let's assume you took the tone and you adjusted it enough so that it was perceptibly louder, or it was perceptibly a different frequency or something like that, or even that the spaces between the tones, because I said they were predictably spaced, even though if the spaces between the tones were changed, then when the change occurred, the orienting reflex would be reinstated. You'd respond to it again. And Sokolov tried to vary the tone on many parameters, but no matter what parameter he varied it on, as long as you could detect it perceptibly, you'd produce an orienting reflex. So Sokolov's idea was that you must be producing a complex internal model of the world that's in concordance with the world across pretty much every perceptible dimension, because if you weren't doing that, how in the world would you know that the tone had changed from what you had already learned about it? And so for the longest time, and this was also true for people who were investigating artificial intelligence, we had this idea that what people did was make a complex model of the world and hold it in their mind, so to speak, and then they'd act in the world and they'd compare what they expected to happen in the world with the model, and as long as there was a match, then there was no orienting reflex. Now the orienting reflex turns out to be quite a complex reflex. It's not merely an alteration in skin conductance. What it is in essence is the manner in which you start to unfold your response to the unknown, and the initial stages of that are very quick, but it's hard to tell when the orienting reflex stops and when more complex learning begins. They sort of shade into one another. So the initial stages of the orienting reflex are quite reflexive, but the later stages can be extraordinarily complex.